With a fine tip marker or pencil, go over where the pins are. We're going to shortly take the pins out, and we need to note where those pins are because they are our seam lines. Once you've completed going over where the pins are with a fine tip marker or pencil, take all of the pins out. Here I'm marking at the bottom of the back shoulder dart, which is about 3 inches long. Marking the side seam. Marking the bottom of the back vertical dart that goes from above the hip line to above the waistline. And now pressing everything flat. With pencil, connect those lines, and in this area I am determining from the neck to the first leg of the dart what distance it is. We'd already measured the model's shoulder, and when the dart is closed, the shoulder width of the muslin is a specific length. The dart is in the center of the shoulder, the dead center. So here I'm actually marking the length and the width of the shoulder dart in the back, and I check to make sure on either side of the dart to the neckline and to the shoulder are the same lengths. Put a little mark at the bottom of the dart. I've marked the length of the dart, it's 3 inches, and it's 1/4 of an inch at the top of the dart on either side. Now I'm connecting the lines from the neckline to that dart. In other words, the little choppy lines, the broken lines that I had filled in over the pins. Fold your dart, pin it as if it's being sewn. And connect the whole shoulder line. Add seam allowance. In this case, I'm adding 3/4 of an inch. That way I have enough to adjust on the model if it needs to be adjusted. But 1/2 inch is usually fine. Make sure your pins are not in the way of the scissors. And trim off the excess. So see, now I have a straight edge of seam allowance line. With your curved ruler, let's connect the broken dots around the back armhole. Connecting the broken lines to make a smooth line down the side seam on the back piece. See how I'm flipping my tool over to create a curve going the opposite direction of the waistline. What I'm doing here is noting where the center back waist dart is, and I want to find the middle of that. Now the middle of that dart from the top to the bottom will be parallel to center back. Because when pinning the muslin sloper, there was no center line yet to draw with, the dart that was pinned may not be perfectly perpendicular to the center back line. So what I'm doing here is shifting it. I find the middle of the dart and note what that distance is from center back, create my vertical line from the top to the bottom of that dart, parallel to center back, and then note where the different markings are and center those intakes of the dart along that center or the line inside the dart, the center of the dart line. Again, measuring what the dart intake is and centering it, shifting it if necessary, so that it's equidistant from the center of the dart, and then connecting all lines from the waist up to the top of the dart. So that my eye will go right to the edges, the top, and the waistline in the bottom, I usually put a tiny little circle around these landmarks. Using what fabric I have for seam allowance, I'm marking a 1/2 inch seam allowance down the edge of the side seam. We'll connect all the dots and then trim off the excess. We'll do the same around the armhole, measuring up 1/2 inch from the seam line to make seam allowance, connecting all the lines with the tools. If there's a discrepancy, because as you see at the bottom of the curve, there's not quite enough fabric, we will correct this when we go to the pattern paper muslin. And moving on to the front piece. Just double checking to make sure my lines are perfectly parallel. Now I'm measuring the dart intake to get a feel for what I need to draw. Marking the waist. The line below the hip. To the far right of the screen is the hemline. I'm drawing the center line of the vertical dart furthest from center front, and now the inside vertical dart center line. On this model, these two darts are only 1/4 of an inch on either side of the center line, from about 2 inches below the waist. Determining what the waist intake is and centering it around those two vertical lines and marking what the intake is. In this case, it's 3/8 of an inch on either side of the vertical center line. Now with my curve, I'm connecting the bottom part of the dart to the waist line. As you see, I'm just flipping it over and using the same exact marking on both sides of the dart so that the curve is exactly the same. From the waist, I use my straight dart and connect the line straight up to the apex line. Apex or bust line. Marking center front line. Now checking the shoulders from the neck to the first leg of the dart, and what I want to do is compare it to the back to make sure it's the exact same length. 2 3/8 on this particular model on either side of the dart. The dart, of course, is in the very dead center of the shoulder line. So see, I have to adjust this a tiny bit. I'm adjusting the shoulder a little bit, pulling it out just a fraction. Now I'm moving from the 2 3/8 inch mark up to 0, and what is in between is the shoulder to bust line dart. And that connects to the vertical dart closest to center front. Filling in the lines for the shoulder seams, adding the seam allowance, and trimming off the excess. Connecting the lines around the armhole. Adding seam allowance. Trimming off the excess. writing in the shoulder width on either side of the dart, as I did for the back. Now what I'm doing is laying the back piece on top of the front, matching the underarm and the seam allowances, or seams. I'm adjusting so that the waistline meets. Pulling it back to check that the hip line meets as well. Just creasing the seam allowance from the already prepared back, so I can lay it right down on the seam of the front. You can see where I'm putting the pins. The seam lines align all the way up to the armhole. There's a slight discrepancy. We'll take care of that in a minute. I want to make sure that the armhole seam lines are the same, even if we have to adjust one or both. I'm marking where the pins are so that I have a seam line marked on the front, just like the back. Now, trimming the excess from the front, both side seams will have the exact same shape. The front piece is extra long, so I'll trim that off. And I'm also going to make both underarm seams the exact same. just filling in the line for the seam allowance. In this case, 1/2 of an inch. Refining that line as this particular underarm was trimmed to match the back, and 1/2 of an inch seam allowance was already worked in. At the center front neck, I'm putting a perpendicular line, perpendicular to the center front line. Truing the neckline, connecting all the dots, and filling in seam allowance. A 1/4 inch seam allowance is all you need for the center front neck. What I was doing there is pinning the hip lines together, front and back, to make sure that this fabric is the exact same on both sides so it doesn't warp while I'm working with it. Pinning the right side down to the left side so it's nice and secure, so that I can start transferring the markings from one side to the other side. Finding the dead center of the shoulder dart and connecting that dot to the apex line in red. Writing the amount of the intake for each side. Pinning the center of that dart through both layers, as well as the outside legs. I'm going to true the top of that dart so that you'll have the correct shape. You'll see how it will have a shape that sews smoothly into the shoulder seam. So you fold the dart, pinning through the outer legs and pressing with your fingers towards the center front as if it were pressed. Make it lay flat and connect the lines on the outside of the seam allowance. Make sure your pins are out of the way of the scissors and cut through all layers. Now we have the seam and the seam allowance above the shoulder. And when you open the dart, you'll see the correct shape of the trued dart. There it is. What I'm doing here is just transferring the vertical darts from the opposite side, and actually I can see right through the muslin. Trimming the excess of the neckline at the edge of the seam allowance. Writing in where the armhole crease is. As you can see, that's about mid-armhole. Inside the seam allowance, I'm writing the amount of the seam allowance. I'm making small snips, which are notches, at the shoulder line. This will help me transfer the dart from one side to the other side with great accuracy. What I'm doing is transferring the dart intake at the waist on the left to the right side of this muslin sloper. filling in seam allowance. I had 1/2 inch around the armhole, 1/2 inch at the shoulder, 1/4 inch at the neckline. Lining up the side seams, let's get rid of the bottom of the front that's longer than the back piece. Marking the hip line, trimming the excess. Taking the second back piece, pressing it, we're going to make it what the already marked back piece is. Aligning the edge of the back and the neckline, I'm pinning both of the 1-inch seam allowances together at the bust line, the waist line, and the hip line. Close to the side seam, I'm doing the same. Bust line, hip line, filling in the 1/2 inch seam allowance to make it perfectly 1/2 inch on the next side, and securing the top piece down to the bottom. Folding the dart and pinning it shut as if being sewn. Pressing it towards the center back and cutting along the edge of the seam allowance. Just being sure it's exactly 1/2 inch and trimming off the excess. Marking a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the neck to match the front, and truing with my curve. With pins, I'm going to transfer the markings of the dart from one side to the other. Make sure your pins go straight down and not at an angle. Now I can easily align the pins and the ruler and draw the appropriate lines to create the dart on the second side of the back. Putting a perpendicular line at the top and bottom of the dart, perpendicular to the middle line of the dart, marking the waistline, and connecting all the dots. Snipping tiny little 1/4 inch notches into the shoulder dart. This will help me align to the bottom of the dart on the other side perfectly. Marking the bottom of the dart. Filling in the seam allowance, which is 1/2 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch around the neckline, 1/2 of an inch around the armholes, and filling in the seam lines. Having all the seam lines will help me put this together very accurately. Checking distances. Drawing in the waistline. Making sure I know where the seam line is. The first fit of this muslin in the armhole, there was a small discrepancy from one side to the other, so I want to make sure I know where the actual seam line is. Writing center back, CB, on the center back line on both sides so there's no confusion, remembering that there is a 1-inch seam allowance, SA, seam allowance. And here we have our 4 pieces ready to baste together and try on the model. Just filling in any seam allowances or markings that I might have forgotten. Writing in the model's name and the back sloper just to identify what these pieces are for future reference.